My daughter was standing in my kitchen holding a piece of mail and looking at me with an expression of deep, manufactured concern. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in October, the kind of day where the air in the mountains finally turns sharp and clear. I was pouring my first cup of coffee, minding my own business, when Chloe slid the envelope across the granite island. She told me she had been checking my mail down at the end of the long driveway, just trying to be helpful. She tapped the paper with her index finger and said, "Dad, I think you need to look at this. It looks like your property insurance is being canceled." I set my coffee mug down, feeling a sudden cold knot tighten in my chest. You don't just get dropped by your homeowner's insurance after 30 years of on-time payments unless something catastrophic has happened. I pulled the letter from the envelope and put on my reading glasses. The header belonged to the insurance carrier I had used for 3 decades. The text was formal, bureaucratic, and completely terrifying. It stated that due to the recent total loss payout and a subsequent high-risk reassessment of the property's structural integrity, my policy would not be renewed at the end of the month. I read the words again. Recent total loss payout. I looked up at my daughter. She was watching me closely, her arms crossed her brow, furrowed in perfect symmetry. She asked me what it meant, and if I had forgotten to pay the premium. I told her I hadn't forgotten anything, but my mind was already racing. There had been no damage to my property. There had been no storm, no flood, and certainly no total loss. Yet here was a legally binding document stating that a massive claim had been paid out, and I was now considered too great a liability to insure. Before I go any further, let me ask you, where are you watching from today? And have you ever opened a piece of mail or answered a phone call that made your blood run completely cold because it described a reality that simply didn't exist? Let me know in the comments. I read as many as I can, and it always helps to know I'm not the only one who has faced something like this. I told Chloe I would call the 1-800 number on the letter and sort it out. I thanked her for bringing it up to the house. She lingered for a moment, asking if I wanted her husband, Marcus, to take a look at the house to see if the insurance company was talking about roof damage I might have missed. I politely declined, telling her it was probably just a clerical error. But as I watched her drive her SUV down the winding dirt road toward the highway, I knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't a clerical error. Insurance companies don't accidentally generate total loss cancellation notices. Somebody somewhere had filed a claim on my property, and I was going to find out exactly who it was. My name is Arthur Vance. I am 68 years old, and I live just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. For most of my life, I've been a man who deals strictly in facts, evidence, and the quiet aftermath of disasters. Before I retired 4 years ago, I spent 35 years working as an independent property claims adjuster and fire investigator. When a house burned down, when a hurricane tore the roof off a business, or when a commercial warehouse collapsed, the insurance company sent me. My job was to walk through the ashes, take photographs, read the structural burn patterns, and determine 2 things: how much the damage was actually worth, and whether or not someone was lying. My wife Diane and I have been married for 41 years. She was a middle school science teacher for most of her career. Together we built a quiet, comfortable life. Our pride and joy is our property. It's 6 acres of wooded land on a ridge overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains. 20 years ago, we custom-built a beautiful timber frame house here. But the part of the property I love most is the detached workshop, sitting about 50 yards from the main house. It's a massive, insulated, climate-controlled garage with custom wood-framed windows. That shop is my sanctuary. I spend my retirement out there restoring vintage motorcycles, mostly old Triumphs and BMWs, bringing rusted pieces of history back to life. Everything Diane and I own is tied up in this land. We don't have millions of dollars sitting in offshore accounts. Our wealth is the equity in our home, our pensions, and the peace of mind that comes from knowing we own our slice of the world, free and clear. We worked our entire lives so that, in our later years, we would never be a burden to anyone, and we would never have to ask for permission to live exactly as we pleased. Our family consists of our only daughter, Chloe. She's 34 now, and for most of her life she was the center of our universe. We paid for her college, helped with the down payment on her first home, and did everything a parent is supposed to do. 5 years ago, she married Marcus. Marcus is a local real estate developer and residential contractor. When I first met him, I thought he was charming if a little overly ambitious. He drove a truck that was too clean, wore watches that were too expensive for a guy who poured concrete, and always talked about his next big flip. But Chloe loved him, so Diane and I welcomed him into the family. For the first few years, things were fine, but looking back, there were cracks in the foundation, subtle things, changes in behavior that a father notices but tries to ignore for the sake of peace. The real shift started about 14 months ago. The housing market was tightening, interest rates were climbing, and the easy money in flipping houses was drying up. Marcus's contracting business hit a wall. He came to me one evening, sat on my back porch, and asked for a $75,000 loan to bridge a gap on a property he was renovating. He swore he would pay me back with interest in 6 months. I told him no, I didn't do it to be cruel. I did it because I had looked at his business model and I knew he was over-leveraged. I offered to sit down with him, look at his spreadsheets, and help him restructure his debt. He took it as an insult. He finished his beer in silence, thanked me coldly, and left. After that, the dynamic changed. Chloe stopped calling as often. When she and Marcus did come over for Sunday dinners, there was a strange, tight energy in the air. Marcus would walk around my property looking at the house and my workshop, calculating the value of the timber and the acreage. He would make offhand comments about how much the land had appreciated since we bought it, and how we were sitting on a gold mine. Then 3 months ago, Diane and I took a trip. It was our 40th anniversary, delayed a year because of the pandemic, and we finally booked a 3-week cruise and train tour through Alaska. It was the trip of a lifetime. Since we were going to be completely out of pocket with spotty cell service and no internet for days at a time, Chloe and Marcus offered to house sit. They said they would watch our 2 golden retrievers collect the mail and keep an eye on the place. We were grateful. But when we got back, a few things felt off. Not glaringly wrong, just slightly out of tune. The house was spotless, almost too spotless. When I walked down to my workshop, the heavy scent of fresh industrial paint and chemical cleaner hung in the air. Marcus had painted the exterior trim of the shop and organized my tool chests. When I asked him about it, he gave me a big smile and said it was a welcome home gift. He said he had some downtime and wanted to spruce the place up for me. It was a nice gesture on the surface, but Marcus was not the kind of man to do manual labor for free, especially not for a father-in-law who had recently denied him a loan. A few weeks later, Chloe started dropping by unannounced, asking strange questions. She asked about my digital passwords, claiming she had read an article about how important it was for adult children to have emergency access to their parents' accounts in case of a medical crisis. When I told her Diane and I had all our affairs handled with our estate lawyer, she seemed visibly frustrated. Then there was the mail. I keep meticulous records. I know exactly when my utility bills, tax assessments, and insurance renewals are supposed to arrive. In the weeks after we returned from Alaska, several expected documents never showed up. When I mentioned it, Chloe casually suggested that the post office in our rural area had been losing things lately. I believed her, until she handed me that cancellation letter. As soon as she drove away, I walked straight to my home office. I didn't call the customer service number on the letterhead. When you work in the insurance industry for 35 years, you learn that the frontline phone operators only see what the computer allows them to see. I bypassed the standard channels. I logged into the carrier's online portal using my master policy number. The screen loaded, and there it was, sitting in the digital file like a live grenade. A claim had been filed exactly 6 weeks earlier, right in the middle of our trip to Alaska. The peril was listed as electrical fire. The location of the damage was listed as the detached workshop on my property. I clicked into the claim details, my heart pounding against my ribs. The description stated that a faulty lithium-ion battery charger had sparked an electrical fire in the middle of the night. It claimed that the interior of the workshop had sustained severe smoke damage, structural charring to the roof joists, and the total destruction of specialized restoration tools and 3 vintage motorcycle frames. I scrolled down to the payout summary. The claim had been processed, expedited, and closed. The payout amount was $142,500. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the house suddenly ringing in my ears. I looked out the window at my workshop. It was perfectly intact. There had been no fire, no smoke, no damaged motorcycles. The entire thing was a fabrication. But insurance companies don't just hand over $140,000 on a verbal promise. They require evidence. They require a sworn statement. They require an inspection. I clicked on the Attachments tab in the portal, a PDF titled Field Adjuster Report and Photographic Evidence downloaded to my computer. I opened it. There were 20 high-resolution photographs of a burned workshop. The walls were black with soot. The roof beams were charred. Melted tools and unrecognizable blackened metal frames set in pools of water. At first glance, it was a terrifyingly convincing scene. But the person who filed this claim didn't realize they were dealing with a man who had spent 3 decades analyzing disaster photos. I leaned in close to the monitor, my eyes scanning the background of the images. It took me less than 30 seconds to find the flaw. In the third photograph, which showed the supposedly burned back wall of my shop, there was a window frame visible through the soot. It was a standard mass-produced vinyl window frame. My workshop does not have vinyl windows. I had custom, heavy timber-framed windows installed, so the building would match the rustic aesthetic of the main house. The building in the photographs was not my workshop. It was a completely different structure, likely a tear-down property or a burned garage from one of Marcus's shady real estate deals. I want you to pause for a second. If you were standing in your own home looking at a fabricated photograph that proved your own family was stealing from you, what would you have done right then? Would you have picked up the phone and started screaming? Would you have called the police instantly? Tell me what you would do. For a moment, the betrayal was so sharp I felt physically ill. My own daughter and son-in-law had used our anniversary trip to orchestrate a massive felony against my property. But the anger that flared up inside me quickly hardened into something cold and precise. I knew that if I called Chloe or Marcus right, then the evidence would disappear. If I confronted them without knowing the full extent of the scheme, Marcus would spin a web of lies. He might claim I had authorized the claim before I left and simply forgot. He might tell the insurance company I was suffering from dementia. In fraud investigations, the person who moves first usually makes the biggest mistake. I needed to move last. I needed to let them keep believing they were the smartest people in the room. I closed my laptop and walked into the kitchen where Diane was reading a book. I sat down across from her, took her hand and told her everything I had just found. Diane is a strong woman, but seeing the color drain from her face was one of the hardest things I've ever had to watch. We didn't cry. We sat in the quiet of our kitchen, mourning the daughter we thought we had raised, and preparing to deal with the strangers who had taken her place. The quiet investigation began that afternoon. I needed to know exactly how they had bypassed the security measures. I picked up my phone and called Dave. Dave was a regional claims manager at my old firm, a man I had worked alongside for 20 years. I didn't tell him the whole story, just that I was looking into a suspicious claim on my own property and needed him to pull the back-end routing data that I couldn't access from the public portal. Dave called me back 2 hours later. His voice was low and serious. "Artie," he said, "this file is a mess. The claim was pushed through the rapid response automated system. Because there was a severe weather event 3 counties over that same week, the carrier outsourced the field inspections to a third-party independent adjusting firm to handle the overflow." "Who was the adjuster?" I asked. "Guy named Brian Gable," Dave said. The name clicked instantly. Brian Gable was one of Marcus's old fraternity brothers. I had met him once at a tailgate party years ago. He was a low-level independent adjuster who chased storms for quick cash. Marcus hadn't just fabricated the photos, he had colluded with the inspector. Brian Gable had signed off on the fake photos, certified the total loss, and pushed the paperwork through the automated system, while the carrier was overwhelmed with legitimate storm claims. "Where did the money go, Dave?" I asked. "It didn't come to my bank." There was a long pause on the line. "Artie, the payout check wasn't mailed. It was electronically wired. The file shows a digital signature from you, authorizing a direct transfer into a secondary joint account at a local credit union. The account is listed under your name and Chloe's name." I thanked Dave, hung up the phone, and felt a deep, sickening dread settle in my stomach. I drove into town the next morning and visited that credit union. I sat down with a branch manager, presented my driver's license, and asked to see the records for the joint account in my name. The manager was happy to help. She pulled up the file and printed out the statements. The account had been opened 2 months ago. It had received a wire transfer of $123 to $500 from the insurance carrier. Over the past 3 weeks, the money had been bled out in massive chunks. $30,000 wired to Marcus's Contracting LLC. $40,000 used to pay off a high-interest private loan. $10,000 transferred directly into Chloe's personal checking account. There was barely $12,000 left. But the money wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the document they had used to open the account without my physical presence. The branch manager handed me a copy of the paperwork Chloe had submitted. Attached to the application was a legally binding power of attorney document. It bore my forged signature, along with the stamp of a notary public who worked in Marcus's real estate office. But it wasn't just a standard financial POA. It included a sworn affidavit written by Chloe stating that I was beginning to experience early-stage cognitive decline. It stated that due to my failing memory and my wife's recent physical ailments, I had willingly surrendered control of my financial affairs to my daughter for my own protection. I sat in the uncomfortable chair in the bank lobby, staring at that piece of paper, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, my hands began to shake. They hadn't just stolen money. They had laid the legal groundwork to declare me incompetent. They had weaponized the natural process of aging. They had used the excuse of my wife's previous knee surgery and my own retirement to paint a picture of two helpless old people who couldn't manage their own lives. If I had ever found out about the money and tried to report it, Marcus and Chloe were fully prepared to tell the authorities that I was confused, that I had authorized the claim and simply forgotten, and that my accusations were the tragic result of a declining mind. This was not a mistake born of desperation. This was a calculated, predatory trap. Chloe had looked to the father who carried her on his shoulders, who paid for her wedding, who loved her unconditionally, and she had seen nothing but a mark. She had seen an asset to be liquidated. I walked out of the bank into the bright autumn sunlight. I sat in my truck for a long time. I let myself feel the grief, the profound disappointment, and the shame of knowing my own flesh and blood could do this. Then I put the truck in gear. The grief was over. It was time to go to work. I knew I couldn't let them know what I knew. If I showed my hand now, Marcus would drain the rest of the account, destroy his computers, and force me into a prolonged, miserable legal battle where he would play the victim. I needed to trap them in a room with their own lies. I needed to design a situation where their arrogance would compel them to hand me the final pieces of evidence. When I got home, I told Diane the plan. She nodded, her jaw set, and told me to do whatever it took to protect our home. The calm trap began with a phone call to my daughter. I made sure to sound a little tired, a little unsure of myself. I told her I had tried calling the insurance company about the cancellation letter, but I found the automated menus confusing. I told her I was worried about the house being uninsured. I even let my voice waver slightly. "Chloe," I said, "I'm starting to think you were right. With my memory slipping lately and your mother not feeling well, I just can't keep up with the paperwork. I think it's time we put the house and the property into that emergency family trust you were talking about." The silence on the other end of the line was thick. I could practically hear the greed overriding whatever tiny shred of conscience she had left. By offering to put the deed into a trust she controlled, I was handing them the ultimate prize. Once the house was in the trust, Marcus could leverage the entire property for a massive commercial loan. "Oh, Dad," Chloe said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I'm so sorry you're feeling overwhelmed, but you're doing the right thing. Marcus and I can handle everything. We'll take care of you." I told her I wanted to move fast before the insurance fully lapsed. I asked her to bring Marcus over on Friday afternoon. I told her I would have a new insurance agent there to look at writing a new policy for the trust and a paralegal to help process the deed transfer. I told her to bring all her financial files, the trust paperwork, and any recent banking documents so we could consolidate everything in one sitting. She eagerly agreed. Over the next 3 days, I made my preparations. I contacted my estate attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Sarah, who had known our family for a decade. I showed her the forged power of attorney. She was appalled and immediately began drafting the revocation documents. Then I made one more call. I reached out to a contact at the North Carolina Department of Insurance Criminal Investigations Division. A senior fraud investigator named Arthur Vance, no relation to me, but an old colleague from my field days. I sent Linus the fabricated claim file, the IP routing data Dave had pulled, and the bank statements. Linus told me what Marcus had done wasn't just a civil dispute. It was wire fraud, insurance fraud, and identity theft. It was a federal and state nightmare. Friday afternoon arrived. The sky over the Blue Ridge Mountains was overcast, threatening rain. Diane decided to stay upstairs. She said she couldn't bear to look at Chloe's face and pretend everything was fine. I didn't blame her. I set up the dining room table with fresh coffee water glasses and a neat stack of manila folders. Imagine sitting across from the child you raised, smiling, offering them a drink, while knowing exactly what was inside your briefcase. It takes a certain kind of patience. At exactly 2 o'clock, Marcus's truck pulled into the driveway. He and Chloe walked through the front door, looking like they had just won the lottery. Marcus was wearing a crisp polo shirt, carrying a thick leather briefcase. Chloe rushed over and gave me a hug that made my skin crawl. "Dad, I'm so glad we're doing this," she said. I led them into the dining room. Sitting at the table were Sarah, my attorney, and Mr. Linus, the state investigator. I didn't introduce them by their full titles. I simply said, "Chloe Marcus, this is Sarah, who is helping with the legal paperwork, and this is Mr. Linus, who is looking into the insurance issue." Marcus puffed out his chest completely, unthreatened by two people he assumed were low-level paper pushers. He opened his briefcase and pulled out the trust documents he had hurriedly prepared. "Arthur," Marcus said smoothly, "I know it's tough to let go of the reins, but putting the deed in Chloe's name under the trust is the smartest move. It protects the asset. And as for the insurance cancellation, don't worry about it. I have a buddy who writes high-risk policies. We'll get it covered." I took a sip of my coffee. I let the silence stretch out for just a few seconds too long. "I appreciate that, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice entirely level. "But before we sign over the deed to $1 million property, Mr. Linus had a few questions about the old policy." Marcus smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Sure, shoot." I reached into my folder and slid the high-resolution photograph of the burned workshop across the table. It stopped right in front of Marcus. "I was looking at the claim file," I said softly. "You know, the one for the electrical fire that supposedly happened in my workshop while Diane and I were in Alaska. The one that paid out $142,000. Marcus's smile froze. His eyes locked onto the photograph. The color drained from his face so fast, he looked physically ill. Chloe leaned over, looking confused. She clearly knew about the money, but I suspected Marcus hadn't told her exactly how he had fabricated the evidence. "I have to tell you, Marcus," I continued, tapping the photograph, "you did a great job cleaning up the shop for me. The fresh paint was a nice touch. But I'm curious. When did I have mass-produced vinyl windows installed in my custom timber frame building?" Marcus swallowed hard. His hands dropped under the table. "Arthur, I don't know what you're looking at. That's a mistake." "It's not a mistake," Mr. Linus said, speaking for the first time. The investigator's voice was like gravel. "It's a Class H felony. Mr. Vance, I'm an investigator with the State Insurance Board. We have the digital logs showing this claim was uploaded from the IP address registered to your contracting business. We also have the wire transfer logs showing the payout moving into an account you control." Chloe jumped up from her chair, panic washing over her face. "Dad, what is this, Marcus? What is he talking about?" "Sit down, Chloe," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. She slowly sank back into her chair. I looked at Sarah, my attorney. She slid a second piece of paper across the table. It was the power of attorney document. "This," I said, looking directly at my daughter, "is the document you submitted to the credit union. The one where you swore I was losing my mind. The one you used to steal my money, pay off your credit cards, and fund your husband's failing business." "Dad, no," Chloe stammered, tears suddenly welling in her eyes. "Marcus told me the insurance company approved an advance on the estate. He told me it was a legal loophole to protect our assets." "Stop lying, Chloe," I said, the coldness in my own voice surprising even me. "You didn't log into a bank account, look at $140,000 that didn't belong to you, and think it was a loophole. You signed a document declaring your father mentally incompetent, so you wouldn't have to wait for me to die." Marcus finally found his voice. He puffed up, trying to salvage his pride. "Look, Arthur, the business was tight. The money is just a loan. I was going to pay it back. You can't prove I took those photos." Brian Gable signed off on that inspection. Mr. Linus smiled, a grim, terrifying smile. "Brian Gable lost his independent adjuster license at 9 o'clock this morning. He's currently sitting in a room with state police fully cooperating. He gave us your text messages, Marcus. The ones where you promised him a $10,000 kickback to push the fake photos through the automated system." The remaining air left Marcus's lungs in a single ragged breath. He looked at the door, but he knew running was pointless. He had walked into this house expecting to steal the deed to my property. Instead, he had walked into a meticulously built cage. "Here's what happens now," I said, leaning forward, resting my arms on the table. "You are not going to leave this house with a single piece of paper. Sarah is filing the injunction to freeze your business accounts. Mr. Linus is taking these documents to the district attorney, and I am going to watch you walk out of my house, off my land, and out of my life." Chloe started sobbing openly, reaching across the table for my hand. "Daddy, please, please. We'll give it back. Don't do this. I'm your daughter." I looked at her, feeling a profound, heavy sorrow. "You were my daughter," I said quietly. "But the person sitting across from me is just a thief who got caught. Leave." They didn't say another word. Marcus packed up his briefcase with trembling hands. Chloe cried the entire way to the truck. I stood on the front porch with Diane, who had come downstairs, to stand quietly by my side, and we watched them drive down the dirt road for the last time. The consequences were swift, brutal, and entirely deserved. The state insurance board did not mess around. Marcus was indicted on multiple counts of insurance fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Because the amount exceeded $100,000, the charges carried mandatory minimum sentences. His contracting business collapsed overnight. The bank called in his commercial loans, and his assets were seized to pay restitution to the insurance carrier. Brian Gable, the corrupt inspector, accepted a plea deal to testify against Marcus, but he still faced significant fines and the permanent loss of his career. Chloe tried desperately to play the victim. She hired her own lawyer and claimed Marcus had emotionally manipulated her into signing the bank documents. But the investigators pulled the bank logs. They showed that Chloe had personally initiated the transfers from the fraudulent account to pay off her own luxury car loan and personal credit cards. She avoided prison by taking a plea deal for accessory to fraud, but she was slapped with 5 years of supervised probation and court-ordered restitution. Her marriage to Marcus disintegrated almost immediately under the weight of the criminal charges. As for Diane and me, we spent several weeks untangling the mess. The insurance carrier, once presented with the findings of the state investigator, formally cleared my name. They reinstated my policy in full and issued an apology for the distress caused by their automated system. Sarah, our lawyer, helped us freeze our credit change, all our estate documents, and establish ironclad legal protections to ensure Chloe could never attempt to claim power of attorney again. It has been 8 months since that afternoon in the dining room. The criminal trials are wrapping up, and the dust has mostly settled. I would be lying if I said the house didn't feel a little quieter now. Losing a child to their own grief is a specific kind of grief. You don't mourn someone who died. You mourn someone who chose to destroy the foundation of your family for a quick payout. Diane and I have had to lean on each other heavily. We go for long walks with the dogs. We spend time with friends. We are healing. But I'll tell you this, I have never once regretted setting that trap. I spend my mornings out in the workshop now, turning wrenches on a 1968 Triumph motorcycle. The air smells like oil and old steel. The custom wood windows let in the morning light exactly the way I designed them to. I look around this shop, and I am reminded of why I worked so hard for so many years. Though I didn't build this life just to hand it over to someone who viewed my aging as an opportunity. I spent my entire career walking through the ruins of disasters, looking for the truth beneath the ashes. I learned a long time ago that you can rebuild a house after a fire, and you can recover from a storm, but you cannot build a safe life around people who are quietly holding a match. Aging does not mean becoming obsolete. Being a loving parent does not require you to turn a blind eye when you are being targeted. We are taught to trust our families unconditionally, but unconditional love should never mean unconditional access to your dignity, your independence, or the safety of your home. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stand your ground, gather your evidence, and let the truth do exactly what it is meant to do. Has someone you loved ever made you question everything you thought you knew about them? Have you ever had to choose between keeping a toxic family member close or protecting your own peace? Share your story in the comments below. I read them all, and I know this community finds strength in hearing from one another. Thank you for listening to my story today. If you appreciate hearing about people who stand up for themselves and let the truth win in the end, consider subscribing to the channel. Take care of yourselves, protect what you've built, and I'll see you in the next one.